So first off, what are special needs trusts? That's the big question. We hear this term, but a lot of people don't know what that means or how they would apply in their situation. So they are typically known as a supplemental needs trust or a supplemental income trust, meaning that this type of trust is meant to supplement other benefits. And so that's why they're created. They're not meant to replace other benefits or other resources, but just to supplement those resources. And they're typically connected to public benefit options. So public benefits for a disabled person would the basic ones are typically some form of Social Security insurance payments, so Social Security disability or just SSI. And then the other one that typically comes up is Medicaid or Medicare, so medical benefits. There may be other benefits that connect to that, depending on the person's income with food stamps and other things like that. But we're really focused on the Social Security benefits and then the Medicaid, Medicare benefits for a disabled person. Special needs trusts are irrevocable, meaning that once they're created and money is put in them, they become permanent in nature and they're not available as an asset for the disabled person, but also the income or the trust fund is not available for anybody else also. So it becomes kind of permanent in nature, and it's set up that way so that it can be that supplemental resource for that disabled person throughout their lifetime. So that's what a special needs trust is. So there's different kinds of special needs trusts that you see out there. So the first one, and this is typically the one that we deal with the most, would be considered a third-party special needs trust. So that means it's somebody besides the disabled person that is creating this trust for the benefit of that disabled person. And it's using somebody else's money to fund that trust. So the disabled person, if they have money, it's not being used for this purpose. Typically what you see from most people in this situation would be a parent or parents creating a trust on behalf of a disabled child or disabled person within their family, and then using their own money to fund that trust for the benefit of that disabled person. Okay, so that's how that one works. And this is the most common one that you see. So then you have a first party special needs trust, which is if the disabled person himself or herself has money, they can create a special needs trust on their behalf. And it's actually created and funded from their own money. Okay, this doesn't come up too often because most disabled persons don't have, individual independent money that they can use to fund a special needs trust. But this is another option because it does happen. Sometimes people would get money from different reasons, from an accident, a settlement of some kind, potentially even an inheritance of somebody that didn't plan ahead, and they potentially could use that money to create this first party special needs trust. Then there's also things called pooled trusts that are created from the assets of the disabled person, but they go into it, as the name says, they go into a big pool that's managed by, so there's multiple beneficiaries, there's money all kind of pooled together in this trust, and they're managed, somebody manages that for multiple individuals. So a pooled trust. The first party in the pooled trust can come up in the elder law scenario also. So when somebody gets older and they become disabled and they're having concerns about Medicaid issues at that point, special needs trust potentially can be used in that category also. We look at a lot of this as disabled persons, a lot of family child type relationships, but it can come up in the elder care scenario also. So those are the different types of special needs trusts. Like I said, the third party one is typically the one that we run into the most, that we see the most frequently. So why are special needs trusts even important? Why are they even needed? the main reason is because people with disabilities have a lot of needs besides just basic medical care, food, clothing, and shelter, and things that are not covered by public benefits. So public benefits are meant for those things I just mentioned: medical care, food, clothing, and shelter. And medical care, public benefits, if they have Medicaid, Medicare, it's pretty comprehensive in coverage. The Social Security, which is supposed to cover food, clothing, and shelter, typically is not a lot of money. And so the people, a disabled person that's relying on Social Security as their only source of benefit of funding to make sure they have their food, clothing, and shelter taken care of, they're going to live a pretty basic life as far as their lifestyle is concerned. Social Security just does not provide enough revenue and income to help that person live a quality life. They're just going to live just a basic life and not have much other than the very basic things in their life. So things that a disabled person may need or may want in their life that is just not going to be provided by public benefits would be recreation or travel, transportation, like having a vehicle or having the ability to just, have access to that type of transportation. Dental care, that doesn't fall under the medical side. Telephone, television services, internet services, which, for most people now, that's become pretty common that they have access to that and actually use it pretty consistently. Grooming, haircuts, nail care, that kind of stuff, if they enjoy that, like that kind of stuff, the public benefits may not be sufficient to help provide that. Differentials in cost of housing and shelter. So essentially what that's saying is, they may want to live in a better place. I mean, that's the practical answer. They may not want to live in the cheapest, nastiest rental property that there is. They may want to actually be able to upgrade and live in a better place. Supplemental nursing care is part of that. Mobility aids comes up quite a bit, especially as people age over time. Public benefits aren't set up to provide for that. And so if they need that type of assistance with mobility, special needs trusts come into play to help provide for that. So special needs trusts are really important to provide, and the basic way to look at it is to provide quality of life to a disabled person. So not just basics, but actual quality of life to make sure they're taken care of throughout their lifetime. So for example, as a parent towards a child, they're going to do everything they can to help that child have a quality of life. And we're just trying, with a special needs trust, you're setting that up to ensure that that quality of life can actually continue if you're not available to care for them. Okay. So how do you know if a special needs trust is the right planning tool for a disabled person? Is this the right thing for this person and our family? So here's just kind of a series of questions that you can ask yourself, and depending on the answer, that'll kind of give you some guidance. So the first two are kind of the critical ones. So first one, does the disabled person have sufficient assets to cover the full costs of his or her lifetime needs? Okay, and if the answer to that question is no, they don't have sufficient assets to cover their full costs, then that's a special needs trust is the right planning tool for that disabled person. Again, most disabled people do not independently have wealth on their own, okay? And so if they are relying on the public benefit system, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, or any other type of benefits they may qualify for, they are probably not going to have the full cost of their lifetime needs covered with those things. They'll have maybe the bare minimum, the basic, but not the full cost. Okay, question number two, will the beneficiary need public benefits now or in the future? Or another way to look at it, are they already on public benefits? So that's important, because if they in fact do need public benefits or are already on public benefits, if they receive a chunk of money through inheritance or otherwise directly to them, they're gonna potentially lose those public benefits, at least for a time. Probably not permanently, but there may be a gap essentially in there where they have to pay for their own care. And really where that comes into play, the most important is on the medical side. So if if a disabled person lost their Medicare or Medicaid, and then had some medical issues in that timeline where they didn't have that benefit, that could eat up their entire inheritance, for example, or other cash assets that they may have received. So in a sense, they really don't even get that because they lose their public benefits. They end up having to pay all that money into the system, and then they can reapply for public benefits later on. But the intended purpose of maybe giving them some extra money or whatever ends up actually working against them and causing a problem for them. There's also a huge concern over financial abuse in this scenario with disabled people or special needs people. And so anytime there's a cash transaction towards a disabled person, there's just a huge risk of financial abuse from other people taking that money or misusing it, or just a variety of different things that could come up from a financial abuse scenario. Okay, so if we have a public benefits issue, special needs trusts are really critical in that scenario. So question 3, do you want to provide a supplemental resource for the disabled person to cover things public benefits do not cover or cover insufficiently? And so if the answer to that question is yes, I want to make sure I preserve quality of life for that disabled person, then a special needs trust is the way to go, because that is exactly what that's there for, is to provide that supplemental resource to make sure the special needs individual has that resource available for them to live that quality of life. Do you have other potential errors that need to be considered when planning for the disabled person? So if you do, the big issue here is you want to make sure you structure your planning so that it benefits both sides of the equation, for the disabled person and also for the other family members. Now, we have some clients that put everything towards the disabled person, which is great. That's not problematic, but they need to make sure their estate plan is very clear as to the purpose behind that, so they can avoid potential dispute with other family members later on. Other families want to make sure they balance that out, between the disabled person and the potential, the other potential heirs, and make everything, equal and work well for everybody. And so, estate planning is critical in that scenario too, to not only plan for the non-disabled persons, but have this special needs category set up for the disabled person so that so both sides of that equation work well with each other and we don't have any conflicts. You can't treat the disabled person the same as the non-disabled children or heirs. So that the estate planning is really critical there. So do you want to avoid Medicaid claims for the disabled person in the future? So a third-party special needs trust, when it's created, is not subject to Medicaid recovery. And so that means the disabled person can be on Medicaid and have that resource 100% available to them, and also have the supplemental income available to them through the special needs trust, without that special needs trust being required to repay Medicaid benefits. So that's a real big benefit for that disabled person. Get full medical coverage and also have this other resource available to them to help provide them, that supplemental benefit without losing any of that money to Medicaid. So it's a huge thing for the disabled person. And then the last one, I kind of already talked about this, but you want to ensure the disabled person remains qualified for public benefits. Again, if they receive money directly through inheritance or otherwise, even if it's gifted to them, they have the means testing and everything with a disabled person through Social Security and Medicaid may result in them losing those public benefits, at least temporarily, and then having to reapply for them. And so to avoid that, to make sure they can stay on those benefits without loss or gaps or having to reapply, the special needs trust is the way to put that. You can direct that money to that special needs trust, and then they don't have to worry about going through the public benefit reapplication or loss or means testing or anything like that. They can just keep those benefits and then have that supplemental resource. So looking at those questions, if you have if you know somebody that's in the disability category, special needs category, and you're looking at these questions and you're saying, no, they don't have sufficient assets. Yes, they're on public benefits. Yes, I want to have a supplemental resource for them. I want to make sure my planning for the disabled person works together with any planning for other errors. I want to avoid Medicaid, and I want to ensure they can remain qualified for public benefits. If you're answering those questions in that way, then yes, a special needs trust is the way to go for you and for that disabled person. So how does a special needs trust benefit the disabled person above and beyond what's available from the public benefits? So there's going to be a pretty big list here. I probably won't go through all of them, but maybe touch on them. The special needs trusts have a lot of flexibility on what they can pay for outside of just basic stuff. So out of pocket medical and dental expenses, eyeglasses, like I said, transportation vehicle, they could pay for vehicle maintenance and insurance premiums, pay for life insurance. If they have some hobbies they like to do, maybe they like to make jewelry or something like that. The special needs trust can pay for tools and supplies so that they can do that. Maybe they like art and they want to have a bunch of canvases and painting equipment. The special needs trust can pay for that. And those are kind of things that Social Security is just not available to pay for that. Once rent and food are paid, in a non-family home scenario, they probably aren't going to have any extra money to go out and pay for hobbies and things like that. So the special needs trust can help supplement that. Tickets for recreational or cultural events. If the disabled person loves to go to Disneyland every year, guess what? They can pay for that trip and vacation to Disneyland and pay for somebody to go with them to make sure they're taken care of while they're there. We talked about internet, computer, electronic equipment, internet things. That's tablets, cell phones, things that are pretty commonly available now for people, and typically the disabled people have access to those just as much as anybody else, and so those are available to them. Athletic training or competition, so maybe they're into the Special Olympics, and they want to go do that in multiple different locations and travel to those places to compete and to be involved with that. The special needs trust can help pay for that and make sure that that's something available to them. They could help with tuition and expenses connected with education. So essentially, there's a lot of things that a special needs trust can do. You can look at those there on the screen and see that it's actually pretty open, to do that. And really it comes down to a lot of these things maybe we take for granted as just something. Of course we should be able to do this kind of stuff, but they come down to quality of life. A lot of these things are quality of life issues, and the special needs trust is there for quality of life, whereas Social Security, like I said, is there for basic life, not for quality of life. And rarely is Social Security going to be sufficient to provide any of these supplemental things to that disabled person. They're simply just not going to have the resources available to explore these other type of things if all they have is Social Security. Okay. We sometimes we come up in discussions about this. People come up with questions about, are there alternatives to a special needs trust and how they may apply. And so we're going to go through a few of those here. The first one most commonly that we hear about out there is what are called ABLE bank accounts. And we hear this from the social workers. We hear this from just different avenues. People talk about these kind of in passing and generic. Bad thing about ABLE accounts is they are not available in Idaho. And so if you're wanting an ABLE account, which kind of serves a similar function as a special needs trust, maybe not quite as restrictive in what they can be used for, but you have to go outside of the state of Idaho to get an ABLE account set up. And so then you're then you're having to pay for that bank fees and possibly just whatever is going to occur with that in that other state. And so you really don't have any control over that. So these are not available in Idaho right now, but it is something that you hear people talk about. And for the most part, what I've ran into is people are kind of misinformed about ABLE accounts. and people talk about them being this great solution, but then they find out that they're not available here. And so regretfully, the people that promote these accounts don't really discuss that end of it, the availability of those accounts or unavailability of those accounts. And so that it can get kind of confusing for people as to what's available, what's not available. Another thing is conservatorship. You see, people with that have done essentially no type of planning that end up having to have conservatorships over their money. But conservatorships don't protect money from the means testing for public benefits. They're expensive because you're paying for attorneys and court costs to get them set up, and they have an ongoing monitoring responsibility with the court system. So once they're set up, they're essentially under the thumb of that court system financially until there's no money left. And so there's some outside control over the resources for that disabled person that maybe don't have that person's best interest in their mind. So the other thing that we've got, so those are expensive and really unnecessary. With proper planning, there's no reason to ever go down the conservatorship road. So the next one we have, living trust with special needs trust conditions. So a lot of living trusts, at least that we do, we have a clause in there that can take into account any issues with special needs that may come up, and allow the trustee to essentially distribute the money in a special needs for a special needs person in the right way. And so that's like kind of like a bare minimum of estate planning, is to have those conditions at least at a minimum in the living trust, so that if that does come up, the trustee can manage it correctly. So here's the most common thing that we see. People do nothing. And that is an alternative to a special needs trust. And it is really what happens the most frequently. And the bad thing about that is it just exposes that disabled person to that loss of public benefits and Medicaid reimbursement claims and all that could occur when there is no planning in place. And then the last one that we have had this come up a little bit is just disinheritance, where people actually disinherit the disabled person completely. And that does work from the perspective of not exposing them to the risk of losing public benefits. But now they're 100% reliant on public benefits, and because they're not going to get anything to help them, maintain quality of life. And so that disabled person ends up having no other resource whatsoever except public benefits to provide for their needs. And again, like we've talked about, public benefits are there for basic bare minimum needs. They don't provide quality of life. And so disinheritance does work, but you're putting that disabled person in a situation where they're wholly dependent on the government, which is not a great place to be in. So this is something also that comes up sometimes in a family scenario, is what happens when a disabled child turns 18? Okay, they're living in my house. They're my disabled child. They've always lived here. I'm their mom, I'm their dad. What does it even matter now that they turned 18? So once they turn 18, even though they're disabled, they're still considered a legal adult with all the same legal rights and responsibilities as any other child that turns 18. The parents lose all authority over the child, including medical decision making or obtaining medical information for that child. A family doctor may have flexibility on that because they know the parent, they know the child. They may not be super strict on that, but the technical answer is they lose all that authority. And so if the person does not have capacity to be making those medical decisions on their own, this can become a pretty big problem for a parent when they show up at the doctor's office and they're like, well, they're 18 now, we can't talk to you anymore, and you can't make this decision anymore because they're 18. The child can apply for state and federal benefits on their own. It doesn't have to be connected to the parent anymore. So when we get to that point, what do you do? What do you do to protect your child? And so how do we ensure that they're cared for when he or she turns 18? So that's where guardianship comes into play, becoming their guardian through a legal court proceeding, and having those legal rights. Now the legal rights over the person and the medical, all that stuff comes through a guardianship. Setting up a special needs trust for any residual money or inheritance is, again, like this is what we've been talking about. That's there for their benefit, to provide them a quality of life. You can apply for the appropriate benefits on behalf of the child to make sure that they have that care. Again, medical is really big. Social Security is helpful. Doesn't provide a lot of money, but it is helpful. But that medical side of it could be pretty costly without the Medicaid and Medicare. Now, the other alternative is if the disabled child has sufficient capacity, meaning that they can function at a high enough level to understand kind of what they're doing. Maybe not as much as a non-disabled child, but if they can understand, they can actually create powers of attorney and medical directives that would essentially give authority to that parent to do the same thing as a guardianship. The only real negative of this option is capacity is required. So you can't just have them sign something they don't know what they're doing. And it can be revoked, meaning that disabled person could change their powers of attorney and not, and essentially kick out the parents or other trusted person, in the future. So, but that is a good option if they have capacity. It does work, and it helps save all the costs and expenses of guardianship. Sometimes you have to go through the guardianship proceeding to have the professionals say that they have enough capacity, because you may have conflicting information. You may have a family doctor that says no, they don't have capacity to do that. So you may have to go through the guardianship process, and then in the end, the guardianship specialists, they call them a committee, they may come back and say, well, we think this person does have capacity. And so if they do come back with that, that's okay. You can, at that point, you can have them sign those documents, because now you have a report that says, yes, we do think this disabled person does have capacity to do the powers of attorney. That's a critical step. So again, a lot of families, when they have a disabled child and they're about to turn 18, or they already have, the most common practice is they do nothing. And so then when they end up going to a medical facility or whatever, and they start running into these problems, then they start to realize, hey, I've got to do something more than just kind of keep the status quo. And sometimes it can be in a medical emergency, and then they have no authority whatsoever, and that creates a huge issue for both the parent and the disabled child. So we're here to help. We love helping special needs situations and helping people plan appropriately so that they can be successful and make sure that they can provide quality of life to their disabled loved one, and get that set up. So